I'm Jeane Anastas, and on behalf of NASW and personally, I welcome you to the special NASW Symposium on the Feminization of Poverty Revisited. We're looking forward to a very exciting program of speakers and panelists today, and I'm delighted that each and every one of you has taken the time to be here for this event. As we all know, disparities in income and wealth continue to increase in the United States and also continue among and within nations around the world. While women and girls worldwide face many economic, health, and social disadvantages simply because of their gender, it is also well known that investments in the income, education, and health of women and girls pays off richly for all people, individuals, families, and communities worldwide. We are here today because we know the topic, the feminization of poverty, remains an important one. I will begin by talking about how this meeting came to be. I will then spend a few minutes reflecting on the experiences I have had in my role of NASW president over the last 2 years, talking to a variety of audiences about gender issues within the profession and about how gender inequity affects women and men, families and communities that social workers serve. These experiences are what helped us frame today's event and the topics we will consider. For many years now, I have been involved with the scholarly journal Ophelia, the Journal of Women in Social Work. This journal was started by a small group of women in social work about a quarter century ago, based on the observation that they as scholars were regularly publishing in other professional journals in the field, but their articles on women's issues were generally rejected for publication as not relevant enough to the field. One of Ophelia's founding mothers is here today. Ruth, would you stand? Ruth Brandwein. While things are a bit better now, even recent studies have shown that content on women and girls in other social work journals remains relatively slim, and Ophelia continues to play a major role in getting feminist thinking and content on gender issues published in our field. A few years ago, when the women of Ophelia were reflecting on how best to actualize the organization's mission of advancing feminist scholarship, it was observed that there had not been a national social work conference on women's issues since 1980, which seemed a very long time ago. By the way, the 1980 conference had been organized by the Committee on Women's Issues of NASW and led by then-President Dr. Nancy Humphreys, who was planning to be here with us today, but unfortunately was held up by weather. We have since recalled that there was another one in 1986, and more on that in a minute. But back to Ophelia, our small group then decided to do a conference on our own in collaboration with the Women's Council within CSWE and hosted by the Jane Addams College of Social Work in Chicago. I will not talk in detail about the wonderful events of our unconference, as we called it, except to say that it was entitled Unsettling Feminisms, which was meant to have a double meaning, that feminisms unsettle the status quo, and that we need to unsettle the feminisms of the second wave to pay greater attention to what scholars now call intersectionality, or how race, ethnicity, and sexual identity, among other factors, also play a role in how women and men fare in our society. It was at the Unsettling Feminisms Conference in May 2011 that I met Dr. Diana Pierce, the social worker who first coined the term the feminization of poverty back in the 1970s. Will you stand, Diana? We will say more about Dr. Pierce herself at lunchtime. Two things struck me about this encounter. One is that the knowledge generated by social workers is often not recognized as social work knowledge. Dr. Pierce's work on the feminization of poverty is but one example. To give another, how many of you have heard the term the sandwich generation that describes people, predominantly women, who are taking care of both a younger and an older generation? That term was also coined by a social worker, Dr. Elaine Brody, a well-known gerontologist from Philadelphia who pioneered in research on family caregivers for older people. The second thing that struck me was how relevant the concept of the feminization of poverty remains at present in the United States and globally. Like all scholarly ideas, Dr. Pierce's concept is debated, but her way of looking at gender and poverty remains powerful in sociology and social development. It seemed to me that it was high time for us to revisit this concept and to recommit ourselves to gender equity and the elimination of poverty in our current national context of extreme economic disparities. As my term as NASW president began in the summer of 2011, it happens that two very influential reports were issued in two different fields that got quite a bit of media attention. The first was a study of income and wealth in the United States that I first learned about from the Women of Color Policy Network at a sister school at New York University, the Wagner School of Public Policy. I use statistics from this study and from IWPR regularly. Depending on how you calculate it, women who work full-time in the United States on average earn 78 to 82 cents on the dollar as compared to white men. However, compared to the dollar earned by white men, Hispanic women earn 55 cents and black women earn 64 cents. The wealth gap is even greater. According to that 2011 report, the typical white household has a net worth of about $113,000, while for Latino households the figure was about $6,000, and for blacks it was about $5,600. For single-parent households, white single mothers had an average net worth of $6,000, while white single fathers had a net worth of $25,000. Households headed by Hispanic and black single mothers had a net worth of $0. Poverty in the United States is not just gendered, it is racialized. The second report that came out that summer was in Public Health. It was a meta-analysis of deaths in the United States as related to social determinants of health. As you know, death rates are usually discussed in terms of the diseases that are listed as the cause of death, that is, cancer, heart attack, and the like. Instead of taking a disease perspective, this study looked at low education, poverty rates in the counties in which people died, and other similar factors. What drew headlines was that the numbers of deaths annually that could be attributed to some of these factors, especially low income, low education, and poverty, was as high as heart attack or congestive heart failure, hundreds of thousands of deaths annually, and higher than any specific cancer, for example. The study authors argued that if disease entities that can be associated with death can drive our public health efforts, these social factors could just as logically be used to guide our efforts to reduce mortality and morbidity. Poverty is indeed a life-threatening condition. Everyone who wins election to the NASW board presidency, and I was just incredibly honored when my peers elected me to this office, anyone who is a board president may choose a theme around which to organize their public speaking, their writings for the association, and typically one major public event. For the reasons just described, I chose gender issues, and this choice has served me well. I have written about income and wealth, challenges faced by women in the military, the lessons from history to be drawn from the eugenics movement and the sterilization of poor and disabled women and men, by the way, and the need to protect Social Security and Medicare benefits from proposed reforms that will disproportionately harm vulnerable groups. Finally, because the personal is political, I should add one other thing, which I always mention when I give my talks. My own participation in the consciousness-raising movement of the second wave of feminism, starting in late 1970, not only transformed my life, it quite literally saved it. The critical consciousness that it provided has also changed forever how I view the world. I guess in one way, I am trying to pay that gift forward now. Let me say a little about my experiences on the stump, talking about gender issues. The talk I have been giving at various NASW state chapters and to other social work audiences is entitled Social Work, a Women's Profession. It is focused on two areas: the pay equity and other gender issues that affect the social work profession itself, and how gender issues are affecting the people social workers serve in many areas of practice. Social work itself has the same problems that seem to affect all female-dominated professions, and I want to recognize Beverly McPhail for her essay in social work in 2004, who pointed out that this domination is numerical only. For decades, studies have shown that women in social work earn less than men at all salary levels, a, quotes, unexplained difference that on average adds up to over $400,000 in earnings in a career. Who wouldn't be able to make good use of such a sum to help pay for buying a home or for greater economic security in retirement? This problem, however, is common to all female-dominated professions. While women currently earn about 80 cents on the dollar in the US, in social work it's estimated that the ratio is 88 cents on the dollar, and this is good, but not good enough. The second problem, also common to all female-dominated occupations and professions, is the glass ceiling that women experience versus the glass escalator on which many men ride. Men are more likely to hold administrative and other leadership positions in the profession. Some theorists think that men in women's professions, and by the way, the women they work with, deal with the unacknowledged dissonance of being a man doing women's work by doing male in that context. That is, by doing leadership, doing money, doing power. These are uncomfortable realities to deal with. Needless to say, my stump speech also addresses income and wealth disparities in the US population as a whole, despite the higher educational accomplishments of women. The income and wealth figures for women of color in particular, the concentration of poverty among the elderly that affects single women and households of color, the political participation of women in the United States, which, by the way, was ranked lowest in a group of the world's wealthiest nations, according to a recent United Nations report, disparities in health, mental health, and disabilities, the need for access to the full range of reproductive health care services, issues faced by lesbians and their families, and the special challenges faced by women in the military, women veterans, and their families. These too are uncomfortable realities to face. The other essential element in my talk, however, is a more cheerful one, to point to the strong tradition of women leaders that goes back to the founding of social work in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Some names are familiar in progressive circles even outside the field, like Jane Addams, Jeanette Rankin, Frances Perkins, Dorothy I. Height, and Senator Barbara Mikulski. Others may not be so well known, but all of them remind us that we have the capacity to make a difference. Achieving gender equity is, of course, a form of social justice work. However, one of the ways that we encounter political gridlock is what people mean by social justice. As we know, contrasting views of the social good lead to very different views of social welfare and the proper functions of government. Is it most important for social welfare policy to promote economic growth as measured by the GDP, distributive justice, intangible and intangible goods as defined by Rawls, the guarantee of a social floor, and if so, at what level, average levels of happiness, as is famously being done in Bhutan? Amartya Sen, an economist, and Martha Nussbaum, a philosopher, have been promoting what they call a capabilities approach to social justice issues. Sen, who is from India, in fact, worked out much of his theory in thinking about the many disadvantages faced by women and girls in that context. And Nussbaum, who also worked for a time in India, has a well-known book entitled Women in Human Development. One feature of the capabilities approach is that it gives less emphasis to what perfect justice might look like as an outcome, and places more emphasis on the inequalities or injustices that people experience in their ability to exercise their capabilities. Without getting into philosophical technicalities, let me try to define capabilities. Capabilities are potential human abilities and activities, whether or not they are manifested in actual functioning or behavior. Human capabilities derived from what is biologically innate to the species in combination with the social conditions that allow or do not allow for their expression. Although Nussbaum's use of list of 10 capabilities is controversial in the eyes of some, including Sen, who was her teacher, let me quickly review them as listed in her book. They are life, health, including reproductive health, bodily integrity, the use of the senses, imagination, and thought, emotions, as in being able to have attachments to things and people outside of ourselves, practical reason and freedom of conscience, affiliation, defined as being able to live in relationship to others and to enjoy human dignity, autonomy, and respect in these relationships, Also, to be able to live with concern for and in relation to the world of nature. Play, and the last one is having control with respect to political and material matters, such as the ability to own property. These capabilities are biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. Is this not the social work perspective of person in situation? While economic well-being is our focus today, all of these capabilities must be nurtured for human beings to flourish, and poverty makes it hard for people to reach their full potential. Reading about NASW's conference in 1980 suggests both how much things have changed and how much they remain the same. And here's some pictures from the 1980 conference. The language then was of sex differences, as in my own dissertation in 1982, and sexism. Speakers talked about displaced homemakers, battered women, and women's health, while now we talk about work-life balance, intimate partner violence, and health disparities. The conference in 1986 in Atlanta covered many similar issues. This content included women in the criminal justice system, reproductive health care, issues facing lesbian women, including child custody, biases in mental health care, helping women who have experienced rape and other forms of violence, race and ethnicity, enhancing political involvement, and nurturing women's leadership. These are topics and challenges that would be reflected in a similar conference were it held today. In the NASW News coverage of the 1980 meeting, Barbara Mikulski was quoted as saying, "The women's movement has the potential to be the greatest change agent that our society has ever known. As we end sexism, we also end classism, racism, colonialism, and imperialism." This hope and this commitment remain the same now. Today's meeting, of course, is quite different in that it is invitational, multidisciplinary, and focused on one major issue, the feminization of poverty and its consequences. We will be hearing today about the White House initiatives addressing women and girls, economic facts and figures, and what the lives of women and girls look like in international perspective from one of the poorest nations in the world, and health and mental health issues. We will place these issues in the context of the movement to promote gender equity in the United States, its successes, and how we can continue the work of engaging with younger generations and a more diverse population. To inspire us to action, we will conclude the day with the new chair of the Social Work Caucus in Congress, Representative Barbara Lee from California, who will talk about how social workers and others who work on the same issues as we do can collaborate to make progress. Please join me in thanking Dr. Betsy Clark, our NASW CEO, who has herself been involved in many efforts here in DC to promote gender equity, and the many members of the NASW staff who have organized today's event. Would you all just stand for a moment, please? To them and to all of you for being here today, and I hope we will leave today's meeting armed with new information and inspired to renewed action.